Some people think the loudest person at the gate owns the truth. They're usually wrong. The first thing I noticed wasn't the line of white SUVs parked along my fence. It was the silence. No birds. No wind chime on my front porch. Just the low hum of idling engines and the crunch of my pickup rolling over the gravel driveway that my grandfather laid with his own hands more than 40 years ago. As I eased around the final bend, the afternoon sun flashed across polished badges clipped to belts and bright yellow inspection vests clustered outside my entrance. 5 HOA inspectors stood shoulder to shoulder beside my closed ranch gate, clipboards tucked under their arms like they were posing for a magazine cover. Next to them, wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, was a lawyer holding a thick binder stamped with the HOA logo. At the center of it all stood Patricia Whitmore, president of Cedar Ridge Estates, smiling as though my property had already become another trophy on her list. She tapped her watch the moment my truck came to a stop. "Mr. Walker," she called out, her voice sweet enough to hide the arrogance underneath. "You're just in time. We're about to begin an official inspection." I shut off the engine and listened to the metal tick quietly as it cooled. The smell of warm diesel mixed with fresh-cut hay drifting across my pasture. Behind the fence, my old red barn glowed in the late afternoon light exactly the way it had every summer since I was a kid. Nothing had changed on my land. The only thing that looked out of place was the crowd gathered outside my gate acting as if they already owned it. I climbed out, set my hat on my head, and looked from one unfamiliar face to the next. Not one of them introduced themselves. None of them asked permission to be there. The lawyer simply opened his binder and cleared his throat like an actor stepping onto a stage. Under the authority granted by the association, he began confidently. "Our clients will be conducting a comprehensive property inspection today." I glanced at the heavy chain stretched across my entrance, then back at the group waiting impatiently for me to unlock it. Instead, I walked calmly toward my truck, opened the driver's side door, reached inside, and removed the locked shotgun case I legally kept for ranch security during long drives across remote property. I carried the closed case to my porch and set it beside the front steps before turning back toward the gate. Nobody moved. Patricia's smile widened. One inspector whispered something to another while the lawyer adjusted his tie and gave a smug little nod, as if he had just watched me make the biggest mistake of my life. They had already written the ending in their heads. What none of them realized was that this day had never been about intimidation. It had always been about a property line, a locked gate, and the expensive lesson waiting for anyone who believed confidence could replace the law. My name is Ethan Walker, and if you asked anyone in Cedar Ridge what I did for a living, most of them would probably shrug and tell you I was just the quiet guy with the old ranch outside the subdivision. That assumption had become my greatest advantage. People see worn work boots, a faded pickup with 200,000 miles on the odometer, and weathered fence posts that have stood longer than most of the houses around them, and they build an entire story in their heads. They imagine someone stubborn, outdated, maybe even a little clueless. They never imagine someone who spent years studying the exact laws they casually throw around at neighborhood meetings. My grandfather bought this land in 1978, long before anyone dreamed of building rows of matching homes with decorative mailboxes and perfectly trimmed lawns across the valley. He raised cattle here, repaired every fence himself, and taught me that property lines deserved respect because they represented promises, not just measurements. I still remember the smell of fresh cedar every spring when we replaced broken posts together, the rough texture of old survey maps spread across his kitchen table, and the way he would tap each corner marker with his boot before saying, "Paper proves ownership, but character protects it." After high school, I joined the Marine Corps because I wanted to earn something that could never be inherited. The years changed me in ways that are difficult to explain. They taught me patience, discipline, and the importance of remaining calm while everyone else rushed toward bad decisions. When my service ended, I came home to this ranch with a different goal. I enrolled in law school, focused on real estate and property rights, and eventually built a career helping families keep what legally belonged to them. Ironically, I spent years defending clients against aggressive developers, dishonest contractors, and overreaching associations, yet I never once imagined I would become the target of the same tactics. I kept my profession private because life became much simpler that way. The neighbors believed I repaired fences for extra money, maintained my pasture, and enjoyed peaceful evenings watching the sunset from my porch. That was close enough to the truth. I never corrected them because appearances have a funny way of exposing arrogance. The people who underestimate you usually reveal far more about themselves than they ever intend. Over the past year, Cedar Ridge Estates had expanded right up to my eastern boundary. New homes appeared almost overnight. The steady rhythm of hammers replaced the sound of crickets every morning, and the scent of fresh asphalt drifted across my fields more often than freshly cut grass. Along with the construction came Patricia Whitmore and her growing belief that every piece of land within sight of her clubhouse somehow existed for the convenience of the association. She sent friendly letters that slowly turned into official notices, then notices that transformed into demands. Each envelope became slightly thicker than the last. Each signature carried a little more confidence. I read every page, filed every document, photographed every mailing label, and quietly placed them into a cabinet inside my office. By the time those 5 inspectors arrived at my gate, my file on Cedar Ridge Estates had already become thick enough to fill an entire shelf, and I had a feeling they were about to add the most important chapter themselves. Patricia Whitmore had a remarkable talent for making ordinary neighborhood issues sound like constitutional crises. If a mailbox leaned 2 inches after a windstorm, she spoke as though property values across the county had collapsed overnight. If someone parked a fishing boat in their own driveway for a weekend, she acted like the entire community had become a commercial shipyard. She carried herself with the polished confidence of someone who had never been told no for very long. Every board meeting ended with applause from the same handful of loyal supporters who confused authority with leadership. The rest of the neighborhood simply stayed quiet because arguing with Patricia usually meant becoming her next project. Her favorite phrase was, "Community standards protect everyone." What she rarely mentioned was that her version of community standards seemed to expand whenever she wanted something that did not belong to her. It started small with my property. She mailed me cheerful reminders suggesting that my ranch entrance would look much nicer with matching stone columns similar to those inside Cedar Ridge Estates. When I ignored the suggestion, it became an official recommendation. A month later, it became a violation notice, even though my ranch had never been part of the association. Then came demands to replace my cattle gate with an approved decorative entrance because, according to one letter, passing drivers associated my fencing with the neighborhood image. I remember standing beside that same gate one cool October morning with the smell of damp cedar drifting through the air, reading the notice while one of my horses lazily grazed nearby. I actually laughed. My property had existed decades before Cedar Ridge was even a blueprint on an architect's desk. Yet Patricia somehow believed the older land needed to adapt to the newer development. The lawyer standing beside her that afternoon was Richard Sloan, a man whose confidence entered every room several seconds before he did. His suits were always perfectly pressed, his shoes reflected sunlight like polished glass, and his voice carried that careful rhythm lawyers sometimes use when they expect nobody to challenge them. Richard specialized in representing homeowner associations across 3 counties. From what I had gathered through public records, most disputes ended quickly because homeowners either lacked the money or the patience to keep fighting. Settlements became routine. Demands became profitable. Success made people comfortable, and comfort has a way of creating blind spots. Richard never asked why my responses were unusually short. He never questioned why I refused emotional arguments and simply requested copies of every document they relied upon. Every certified letter I received was answered with another polite request for supporting authority. Every notice became another piece of evidence carefully organized inside my office. They mistook silence for surrender because they expected outrage. Instead, they received patience. Over time, Patricia became bolder. Inspectors appeared along my fence line, carrying measuring wheels and cameras. Drones occasionally hovered near my eastern pasture before quietly disappearing. Neighbors mentioned hearing rumors that my ranch would eventually be incorporated into Cedar Ridge through updated development agreements. None of those stories bothered me nearly as much as one simple detail. Patricia had stopped asking permission. She had begun speaking as though the outcome had already been decided. Standing outside my gate that afternoon with 5 inspectors and Richard Sloan beside her, she wore the satisfied smile of someone convinced she had finally cornered the last obstacle standing between her association and complete control of the land she had admired for months. Unfortunately for her, confidence built on assumptions has an expiration date, and hers was much closer than she realized. The lawyer flipped open his binder with the slow confidence of someone expecting applause instead of questions. I could hear the crisp pages turning from where I stood, carried across the driveway by a light breeze that smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and warm pine. Richard Sloan adjusted his glasses and began reading from a prepared statement as though he were standing inside a courtroom instead of outside a locked ranch gate. According to him, Cedar Ridge Estates had the authority to inspect my property for multiple alleged covenant violations that supposedly affected the surrounding community. He listed them one after another with impressive certainty. An unapproved entrance design, agricultural fencing incompatible with neighborhood aesthetics, improper drainage concerns, visual obstructions, potential safety hazards. Each accusation sounded polished, rehearsed, and completely disconnected from reality. Patricia folded her arms with a satisfied smile every time another item appeared on the list. The inspectors nodded while pretending to compare notes on their clipboards, although none of them had set foot beyond the entrance. That small detail interested me more than anything they were saying. Every conclusion had already been written before anyone had observed a single inch of my land. One of the inspectors finally stepped forward and rattled the chain stretched across my gate. The sharp metallic sound echoed across the pasture before fading into silence. "Please unlock the entrance, Mr. Walker," he said. "We need access to complete the inspection." I looked at the lock for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "Do you have a court order?" I asked calmly. The question hung in the air longer than I expected. Richard answered instead, "That will not be necessary." His voice remained smooth, but I noticed the brief hesitation before the words left his mouth. Patricia quickly interrupted. "You are only making this more difficult for yourself, Ethan. Cooperation always produces a better outcome." I almost smiled. People who truly possess legal authority rarely spend much time talking about cooperation. They simply present the document that grants it. Instead, Richard continued explaining that refusal to allow entry could result in additional enforcement actions by the association. The phrase sounded carefully chosen, broad enough to intimidate without promising anything specific. I had heard language like that many times while representing clients over the years. It relied on uncertainty more than actual law. Another inspector lifted a camera and began photographing my entrance from outside the fence. The shutter clicked repeatedly while someone measured the width of the gravel approach with a tape measure. They documented everything except the one thing that mattered. Nobody produced legal authority allowing them to enter private property. I rested one hand on the closed case sitting beside my porch and quietly watched the performance continue. Patricia noticed the movement immediately. Her smile grew even wider, almost triumphant, as though she believed the situation was unfolding exactly as she had planned. She leaned toward Richard and whispered something that made both of them nod. Whatever story they expected to tell by the end of the afternoon had already been written inside their heads. Meanwhile, I noticed something far more important. Every phone in my security system had already synchronized. Every exterior camera displayed a steady recording light. Every word spoken outside that gate was being preserved with perfect clarity. They believed they were conducting an inspection. In reality, they were creating evidence, one confident sentence at a time. I did not argue because arguments were exactly what Patricia wanted. Raised voices create confusion, and confusion has a way of hiding facts. Instead, I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and calmly opened the small leather notebook I carried almost everywhere. The pages were already filled with dates, times, names, and reference numbers collected over months of increasingly strange encounters with Cedar Ridge Estates. I wrote the current time at the top of a fresh page, noted the weather conditions, counted the number of people standing outside my gate, and recorded each name exactly as it had been introduced. Richard Sloan watched me for a moment before giving Patricia an amused smile. "He is documenting this," he said quietly. Patricia laughed just loudly enough for everyone else to hear. "That is fine," she replied. "He can write down whatever he wants." I almost thanked her for the permission she believed she was granting. While they focused on my notebook, they completely ignored the small camera mounted beneath the porch light, another position near the barn, and two more covering the entrance from different angles. Every conversation outside my gate was being preserved with synchronized audio and video. Even the timestamps matched the recordings automatically. I had installed the system years earlier after helping a rancher prove repeated trespassing during one of my cases. Experience had taught me that memories become unreliable under pressure, but digital evidence remains remarkably patient. One inspector stepped closer to the fence and pointed toward a weathered wooden survey stake standing several feet inside my property. "That marker looks temporary," he announced with complete confidence. "We will probably recommend relocating the boundary." I looked at the stake and recognized the faded orange paint my grandfather had brushed onto it decades earlier after a licensed county survey confirmed the property corners. It had survived heavy rain, summer heat, winter freezes, and more than 40 years of changing seasons. Apparently, it was now expected to survive opinions as well. Richard continued flipping through his binder before producing another document. He held it high enough for everyone to see without allowing anyone close enough to actually read it. "Our records support the association's position," he declared. That sentence caught my attention more than anything else he had said all afternoon. He carefully referenced records without identifying them. He spoke about authority without presenting it. He relied on confidence instead of clarity. Every statement followed the same pattern. Patricia noticed several neighbors beginning to gather along the public road a few hundred feet away. Curtains moved inside nearby houses. A jogger stopped with headphones around his neck. 2 delivery drivers slowed almost to a crawl as they passed. She seemed pleased to have an audience. Public pressure had probably worked before. She expected embarrassment to accomplish what paperwork could not. I simply closed my notebook, slipped it back into my pocket, and looked once more at the locked chain across my entrance. Nobody outside the gate realized that the afternoon had quietly shifted in my favor. Every exaggerated claim, every unsupported instruction, every confident assumption had become another carefully preserved piece of a puzzle that was almost complete. All that remained was for someone to make the one mistake I had been expecting from the very beginning. The moment arrived so quietly that I almost missed it. One of the inspectors, a younger man with a reflective vest hanging loosely over his shoulders, looked at Patricia for approval instead of at Richard. She gave the smallest nod, barely more than a tilt of her chin, but it was enough. He reached through the chain, lifted the latch as far as it would go, and tested the gate with a firm pull. When it refused to move, he glanced back again. Richard did not stop him. In fact, he looked down at his binder as though whatever happened next had nothing to do with him. That was the first truly interesting decision anyone had made all afternoon. The inspector then stepped sideways, found the narrow opening beside the fence where the drainage ditch crossed the property line, and placed one boot on my side of the boundary. It was only a single step, no farther than a couple of feet, but it changed everything. I looked down at the old survey marker standing beside him, then back at the fresh boot print pressed into the dry soil. "Please stop right there," I said in the same calm tone I had used since pulling into the driveway. He froze, more surprised by my politeness than by my words. Patricia folded her arms. "He is only performing his duties," she answered confidently. "No," I replied. "He is standing on private property without my permission." Richard finally looked up from his binder. "Our position remains that the association possesses inspection authority." I nodded once. "Then I would appreciate seeing the document that authorizes entry onto land outside the association boundaries." He turned several pages, but never produced one. Instead, he repeated the same statement with slightly different wording. Around us, the late afternoon breeze carried the scent of sun-baked cedar across the pasture, while a loose section of fence wire vibrated softly against an old wooden post. Everything on the ranch felt completely ordinary except for the conversation unfolding at the entrance. I reached into my pocket, removed my phone, and pressed a single button. The screen displayed 4 synchronized camera angles, each showing the inspector's position from a different perspective with clear timestamps in the corner. I held the phone where everyone could see it without saying another word. The inspector instinctively looked down at his own boots. Patricia noticed his hesitation and immediately tried to recover the moment. "Continue," she instructed. "We are not leaving because of a camera." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. "The camera is not the important part," I said. "The recording simply preserves choices." Richard narrowed his eyes for the first time all afternoon. The confidence that had carried his prepared speech began to fade into careful calculation. He was finally asking himself the question he should have considered before driving to my ranch. Why had I remained so calm? The answer was standing only a few feet away inside my office, neatly organized in labeled binders containing certified surveys, recorded deeds, county plats, correspondence, and every letter Cedar Ridge Estates had ever sent me. I had never been waiting for an argument. I had been waiting for a decision, and with one careless step across a clearly marked property line, they had finally made it for me. Richard Sloan slowly closed his binder, and for the first time since I had driven into my driveway, nobody outside the gate seemed eager to speak. The confidence that had filled the air only minutes earlier had quietly dissolved into uncertainty. One of the inspectors shifted his weight and instinctively stepped back onto the public side of the boundary, staring at the fresh footprint he had left behind as though he wished it had never existed. Patricia noticed the hesitation immediately. "There is nothing to worry about," she said firmly, directing her words as much toward her own team as toward me. "We are acting within our authority." I looked at her calmly. "Then it should be very easy to identify the recorded easement, the county ordinance, or the court order that authorizes entry onto private property outside your association." Richard remained silent. That silence told me far more than any speech could have. A distant engine echoed across the valley before a marked county vehicle appeared around the bend leading toward my ranch. It rolled steadily up the gravel road without lights or sirens, finally stopping near the entrance. The driver's door opened, and Deputy Mark Ellis stepped out with the relaxed posture of someone responding to a property dispute rather than an emergency. I had known Mark for years through several land boundary cases where he had been asked to keep the peace while surveyors completed their work. He greeted me with a simple nod before turning toward Patricia and Richard. "Afternoon, everyone," he said. "What seems to be the issue?" Richard immediately stepped forward, explaining that the association was attempting to conduct an official inspection but was being denied access. Mark listened without interrupting, then looked toward me. "Mr. Walker?" I reached into my truck, retrieved a neatly organized document case, and handed him a folder containing certified copies of my recorded deed, the licensed county survey, the subdivision plat for Cedar Ridge Estates, and a color map showing the association boundary ending several hundred feet short of my ranch entrance. Mark reviewed the documents carefully, occasionally comparing them with the visible survey marker beside the gate. The only sounds were pages turning in the afternoon breeze and distant cattle grazing across the pasture. After several quiet moments, he closed the folder and looked directly at Richard. "These records indicate this property is not subject to the association's governing documents," he said evenly. "Do you have anything showing otherwise?" Richard opened his binder once more, but the certainty that had defined him all afternoon was gone. He searched page after page before finally admitting, "Not with me." Patricia quickly interrupted. "We were advised that an access easement existed." Mark nodded politely. "Can you produce it?" Another silence followed. It lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt much longer. Several neighbors watching from the roadside exchanged puzzled looks. The inspectors lowered their clipboards. One quietly turned off his camera. Patricia's confident smile disappeared so gradually that I almost did not notice it. The story she had expected to tell the neighborhood was unraveling one unanswered question at a time. Everything she had relied upon had suddenly become nothing more than assumptions, while every document I had quietly preserved for months was now speaking for itself with a clarity that no amount of confidence could overcome. Deputy Mark Ellis handed the folder back to me before turning toward Patricia and Richard with the kind of calm expression that usually meant the conversation had already reached its conclusion. "Based on the documents I have reviewed today," he said, "I do not see any legal basis for entering this property without the owner's permission." His words were neither dramatic nor emotional, but they landed with far more weight than any raised voice ever could. Patricia immediately tried to regain control. She insisted there had to be updated records somewhere, claiming the association had been informed that future development plans included my ranch. Mark simply asked one question. "Have those plans ever been approved and recorded?" Richard lowered his eyes to the binder one last time before quietly answering, "No." That single word seemed to drain the remaining confidence from everyone standing beside him. The inspectors looked at one another, uncertain whether to continue taking notes or close their clipboards altogether. One by one, they stopped writing. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of dry grass across the entrance, while the American flag on my porch shifted gently in the wind. Everything felt strangely peaceful now that the performance had ended. I thanked Deputy Ellis for taking the time to review the documents instead of accepting assumptions. He nodded and reminded everyone that property disputes were resolved through proper legal procedures, not by crossing clearly established boundaries without authority. Patricia attempted one final argument, insisting that refusing the inspection would have consequences. I answered as calmly as I had all afternoon. If your association believes it has a valid legal claim, you are welcome to present it through the proper process. Until then, my gate remains closed. Richard closed his binder with a slow sigh that sounded very different from the confident snap it had made earlier that day. He quietly advised the inspectors that it was time to leave. None of them argued. None of them questioned the decision. They simply gathered their measuring tapes, cameras, and clipboards before walking back toward the white sport utility vehicles parked along the road. Several neighbors who had been watching from a distance slowly dispersed as well, their conversations replacing the silence that had settled over the ranch earlier. Before getting into her vehicle, Patricia turned toward me with an expression that mixed frustration with disbelief. I could tell she still expected me to celebrate, lecture, or demand an apology. Instead, I simply wished everyone a safe drive home. That seemed to confuse her more than anything else that had happened. She had prepared herself for conflict, not restraint. As the last vehicle disappeared around the bend, I picked up the locked case that had remained untouched beside my porch from the moment I set it down and carried it back inside the house. Then I walked into my office, placed the day's security recordings into a new digital folder, added copies of my handwritten notes, and filed everything alongside the letters, notices, photographs, and certified records I had collected over the past year. The shelf was finally complete. Every claim had been answered by evidence. Every assumption had been measured against facts. The story that began with confidence at my front gate had ended exactly where real property disputes always do, inside a well-organized file supported by the truth. 3 weeks later, the last piece of the puzzle quietly fell into place. I was repairing a section of fence along the western pasture when my phone rang. It was an attorney I had known for years, someone who had heard about the incident through county records and mutual colleagues. He told me that Cedar Ridge Estates had officially withdrawn every notice they had ever issued against my ranch. Every alleged violation had been dismissed. Every demand had disappeared. A few days after that, I received a certified letter confirming exactly what I had expected. The association acknowledged that my property was not governed by its covenants and that no future inspection would be attempted without proper legal authority. The language was careful, formal, and noticeably different from the confident letters Patricia had mailed for months. Confidence had been replaced by precision. That is what facts usually do. Over the following weeks, neighbors gradually stopped by my ranch, not because they wanted gossip, but because they wanted answers. Several admitted they had received similar letters from the association over small issues and had assumed there was no point questioning them. I invited them into my office, spread the survey maps across the same old wooden desk where my grandfather had once taught me how to read property lines, and showed them something far more valuable than legal arguments. I showed them organization. Every letter had been dated. Every conversation had been documented. Every photograph carried a timestamp. Every recording matched the written notes. One neighbor smiled and said, "You won because you are a lawyer." I shook my head. "No," I answered. "I won because I respected the facts before the conflict ever started." That was the lesson my grandfather had tried to teach me all those years ago while we walked these fence lines together. Preparation is invisible until the day it becomes indispensable. Not long afterward, Cedar Ridge elected a new board. I never attended the meeting, and I never asked what happened to Patricia. It honestly did not matter. People come and go. Rules change. Titles disappear. The property lines remained exactly where they had always been. On quiet evenings, I still sit on the same front porch watching the sunset stretch across the pasture while the wind moves gently through the cedar trees. The chain still hangs across my gate. The weathered survey marker still stands where it has stood for decades. The locked case I carried onto my porch that afternoon rests untouched inside my home because it was never the thing that protected my ranch. It simply reminded everyone that I took the security of my property seriously while remaining within the law. What truly protected this land were the documents inside my office, the cameras that recorded the truth without emotion, and the patience to let facts speak before I ever did. Looking back now, I realized the loudest moment of that entire day was never a voice, a threat, or a confrontation. It was the silence that followed when unsupported assumptions finally collided with documented reality. That silence said everything. Justice did not arrive with dramatic speeches or angry confrontations. It arrived one page at a time, one record at a time, one verified fact at a time. My grandfather was right all along. Paper proves ownership, character protects it. And when both stand together, even the tallest walls of arrogance eventually fall on their own.